Hello, I'm Merikay Waldvogel, a quilt historian. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'm a longtime friend of Susan Salser. Today we're here recording, maybe we should call it reenacting, an event that I thought was really good at the Quilters Hall of Fame when Mary Gasperik was inducted. It was about a month ago, July 17th, and Susan gave a really wonderful lecture, and Cathy helped her with the PowerPoint. Together they were a great duo, and it was called Getting to Know My Hungarian Grandmother, Mary Gasperik. But first I'd like to tell you how I have gotten to know Susan over the years. We met almost 30 years ago. It was around 1992. I was working on a book about a Chicago quilt contest, the Sears National Quilt Contest, with Barbara Brackman, and we were actually looking for quilts to include in our book. We were looking for quilts that had been made or entered in that contest, and someone told us about this great quilt exhibit that had been put together in Livermore, California, by the granddaughters of this woman named Mary Gasperik, a Chicago quilt maker. Well, it turns out we did meet with Susan and Karen. We met with Karen first, I think, and she showed us some of the quilts. Barbara and I met in California. We eventually met Susan and Cathy, and we chose Star Arcturus for that exhibit. It traveled. The book was a great success, and it is about Chicago. Well, Susan just latched onto me. I latched onto her. We are kindred spirits. There's no question about it. We have a similar way of going about things, being persistent, not leaving any stone unturned. She might be a little bit more that way than I am in this particular case, but I enjoyed the whole trip, and you're going to get to hear it. And I just thought she summed it up beautifully in her lecture a month ago. She continued her quest to find out everything there was to know about her grandmother. That quilt exhibit in Livermore, California just piqued her interest. And I just feel like her journey of discovery has enriched my life as much as it's obvious it has enriched her life and her extended family. It was just a thrill to see the family there in Marion, Indiana. They'd come from many parts of the United States, and they were just reveling in their grandmother, the quilts, and each other, and getting to know each other. So I'm thrilled today that you are recording the lecture that was given that day. Thrilled I could be here to listen to it again. Thank you. Getting to Know My Hungarian Grandmother by Susan Salser.
Mary Gasperik is the 2021 Quilters Hall of Fame Legacy honoree. This is the lecture I delivered on July 17, 2021 in the Marion Indiana Public Library as part of this celebration. By way of explanation, an exhibit of 23 of Mary Gasperik's quilts was held upstairs in the library, and this lecture was delivered in the library's downstairs meeting room B. My task was to provide an introductory description of Mary Gasperik from the perspective of a grandchild who is one of the preservers of the Gasperik quilt collection, as well as a researcher of the Gasperik quilts. However, the specific focus of my talk, the Gasperik quilt we in the family refer to as Hungarian girls, was provoked by a question Merikay Waldvogel asked me when we were discussing preparations for the Quilters Hall of Fame induction events. Her question was this: which Gasperik quilt do you think won the most ribbons? As a result of that particular question, I decided to utilize my research of this particular quilt to shape this portrait of my grandmother. My name is Susan Salser, and I'm a granddaughter of your legacy quilter nominee to the Quilters Hall of Fame this year, Mary Gasperik. My grandmother was a Chicago quilter who left behind a large body of very high quality work which spans mid-20th century America, beginning from the 1933 Sears Quilt Contest and extending through the birth of her great-grandchildren in the mid-1950s. Mary made perhaps close to 100 quilts, and I have been engaged in researching 68 of them since 1991. Although I grew up in Chicago, not far from her, and saw her fairly regularly, I did not know my grandmother well as a person. I was born in 1940, and from the time I can first remember her until the last time I saw her in the summer of 1968, she was someone who was always engaged in needlework of some kind, primarily quilting, and not someone who shared the story of her life or even her current thoughts and feelings with me and my sisters. She was a mystery to me. It has turned out to be through my examination of her quilts and research into what constituted the world of quilting in America at the time she was making quilts that I have been able to make her acquaintance. Here she is, seated at a Chicago amusement park with me and my sisters. I am the girl in the middle. We are all wearing dresses made and appliqued by my grandmother. This is the Gasperik quilt I love most, both as an 8-year-old girl and as an 80-year-old woman. It brings me my happiest recollections of my grandmother. It resurrects memories of those occasions when our family drove out from our Hyde Park home in Chicago to her East Hazel Crest country home. As a special treat, my sisters and I were occasionally invited to view a set of her quilts, one by one. We lingered over this one and tended to pass over Star Arcturus, whose brash color combination did not appeal to us. Grandma loved watching us inspect this one, hearing us chatter about her selection of fabrics and the girls' hair color and clothing, hearing us try to decide which of the girls was our favorite one, which one was the best, which one we wanted to be. We never tired of admiring it, and she basked in our admiration with pleasure. In truth, I now wonder if she was experiencing the same pleasure we were, the pleasure of putting ourselves into the quilt. After all, she had left Hungary as a 16-year-old. She had real memories of being the daughter of a Hungarian landowner and perhaps seen or participated in a harvest festival, like the girls we saw on the quilt. She offered us a glimpse of this through this quilt and watched us respond to it excitedly. In so doing, I think we were communicating directly with her. That kind of direct communication was not something that happened often. You need to understand that my grandmother did not speak and write English comfortably, ever. She chatted with our mother in Hungarian, and she beamed her love for us. Through this quilt, she presents herself personally to us and now to the quilt world. How shall I tell the story of this quilt? Well, first I will tell you what it depicts. The brightly costumed young ladies, which my sisters and I so admired, and which my grandmother must once have been in her native land, are performing what is called a round dance, a traditional festival dance of Hungary, often performed at harvest time. Hence the fact that this quilt was sometimes referred to as Hungarian Harvest Festival. Here is a photograph of girls doing this round dance, in a Hungarian orchard. They are presumably the unmarried young women of the village, as Mary herself was when she left her mother and father and younger siblings behind in the village of Otelek and went to Chicago to make a new life. This photograph is reproduced from a book called Hungarian Decorative Folk Art, which belonged to my grandmother's niece, Mary Bruland. She sent the book to me after I had contacted her seeking information about a quilt which my grandmother had given her and which, at the time I contacted her, she had donated to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Mary Bruland was herself a needleworker. She made prize-winning crewel work and wanted to explore Hungarian themes in her own work. When she sent me this book, she also sent me 5 old family photographs, which my grandmother had sent to her oldest sister, Anna. Here are 2 of them, showing my grandmother, then newly arrived immigrant Mary Mihalowicz, at a Chicago Park festival. She is standing next to the flagpole in the large group photo and at the left in the trio photo. I see no sign there of her future husband, my grandfather. Mary Bruland, I learned, had met her Aunt Mary only once when she was a girl, and Mary Gasperik took a train trip from Chicago to Los Angeles to visit Anna and meet some Gasperik relatives. Mary Gasperik later sent one of her quilts, a wedding bouquet design, to her sister Anna to give to Anna's daughter Mary when she wed. The top of that quilt is embroidered 1933, the earliest year which is stitched into any Gasperik quilt. Gasperik gave very few of her quilts to people other than her children and grandchildren. Instead, she kept most of her quilts herself. That is where my sisters and I occasionally saw them when we visited her home, initially behind the Gasperik Market on Cottage Grove Avenue on Chicago's South Side, and later in East Hazel Crest. That this quilt left her own care and went to her sister Anna for her niece is unusual. I think it was her careful reading of books like Ruth Finley's Old Patchwork Quilts that taught my grandmother that making and gifting wedding bouquet quilts was an important part of American quilt tradition. I have the 1929 copy of that book, which my mother gave to her mother. It contains my grandmother's hand-penciled notes to herself in Hungarian. That notation says, "This is interesting." The limited number of quilt-associated ephemera which Mary Gasperik left behind included a few clippings from the Detroit News. These seemed to indicate that she attended some quilt contests and shows sponsored by that newspaper and even won some ribbons there. Here is one of her clippings. I decided to request Detroit News microfilm capturing the dates of the Gasperik clippings. From this, I learned that the newspaper's home decorations editor, named Edith B. Crum, had created a newspaper quilt club and organized annual quilt contests sponsored by her paper. These appeared to be very popular, drawing in large numbers of quilts and large numbers of visitors from across the nation. 2,500 quilts on display and 50,000 visitors are figures that the Detroit News reported for at least 2 of those events. I did not know when the club was created or how it functioned. I did not know when or how often the quilt contests were held. I did not know how it was that my grandmother came to be connected with them. Initially, I requested microfilm for years and months, selected in a scattershot fashion, trying to figure out how many contests there were, and when they occurred. I was then interested only in determining the dimensions of the club and contests and looking for things I could connect with my grandmother. In this process, I came to realize that Edith's regular quilt columns and publication of letters from readers and members of the Quilt Club were an ongoing and lively reflection of exactly what was going on in the quilt world of America at the very time my grandmother was engaged in making quilts and spending all of her available time doing it. I realized that the sequence of these sometimes daily columns constitute a detailed narrative of a burgeoning national interest in quilts and quilt making. I concluded that I wanted to read all the quilt columns I could find and that I needed to request every month of every year, start to finish. Initially, the reference librarians told me that this was probably going to be a foolish waste of time because eventually all of this material would be available online and much easier to read. That has happened with many American newspapers, especially local ones. But as far as I know, it has not yet happened to the Detroit News. I was in my mid-50s when I inherited my share of Gasperik quilts and wanted to figure out what they meant. I felt that I would need to research the Detroit News myself if I had any hope of understanding the quilts I and other family members had just inherited. Doing this took nearly 10 years. Now I'm 81 and I'm glad I did it because now I can tell you the story of Mary Gasperik's Hungarian girl's quilt. In my by now systematic research, I requested Detroit News microfilm on an ongoing basis at a local public library, hoping to locate and preserve all possible Edith Crum columns published therein from the beginning of the Detroit News Quilt Club Corner, which she created in 1932, to the point where that club ceased to be sponsored by the Detroit News in January 1942. Only 2 or 3 rolls of film could be requested at a time, and it sometimes took months to receive a new shipment. So my work proceeded at a very slow but steady pace. By then, I was already working on a presentation of Gasperik quilts for the Quilt Index, so I was always thinking about the Gasperik quilts. I made scans of the columns and printed them out at home. I shared all the scans I made with the Quilt Index. Here are 2 shelves of Detroit News notebooks in my home office and a sample open page from one of those notebooks. Because of this wonderful record of the quilt activities and interests of Edith's Detroit News Quilt Club Corner, I can tell you that Mary Gasperik began to create Hungarian girls in 1938. I can tell you that Gasperik joined the Detroit News Quilt Club Corner in October 1935 during the 3rd annual Detroit News Quilt Show and Contest. That was the first time she sent her quilts to that event and took the bus from Chicago to attend it. I can tell you that even though she lived in Chicago and was a member of her local Parks Quilt Club there, she shared her work with the Detroit Quilters and was an active member of the Quilt Club sponsored by the Detroit News. This surprised me. Edith Crum's Quilt Club members actually physically gathered at the newspaper's headquarters on Friday afternoons. I think the recognition her work received in Detroit was a major motivation for my grandmother, and that Edith Crum, far more than the president of her local Chicago Quilt Club, encouraged her and fueled her innate competitiveness. It was only by researching the Detroit News that I could learn this. Months after meeting her at that 1935 quilt show, Edith Crum devoted an entire column to Mary Gasperik. You need to know that Edith made sure there was an actual physical quilt club corner at all her quilt shows. A furnished corner where quilters and show visitors were encouraged to sit and chat and exchange patterns and samples. It was a real meeting place, and it probably provided Edith Crumb the chance to meet and establish a relationship with my grandmother. In that February 1936 column, Edith explains that Gasperik learned about the Detroit Quilt Club in a discarded Detroit newspaper she picked up, and learned there was going to be a quilt contest in Detroit in weeks. She explains that Gasperik immediately sent a batch of completed quilts to the Detroit News and brought a quilt top with her on the bus to Detroit. Merikay Waldvogel found a clipping of that article among her research materials and sent it to me when she was mentoring me during my early research. Her help and encouragement and sharing of resources has greatly helped my research from the very beginning. The particular quilt top the Detroit News pictured and discussed in Edith's February 1936 column is not here, but one of its siblings is. It is the quilt called Burgundy Double Feather Star, whose creation is a different story, one which connects Mary Gasperik to Marie Webster and her iconic book, Quilts, Their Story and How to Make Them. My subject here today is to tell the story of my Hungarian grandmother, Mary Gasperik, through the story of one particular quilt she made, Hungarian Girls. In the course of my decade of reading Detroit News microfilm, I found that Edith Crumb, who presided over the Detroit News Quilt Club corner, as well as writing about quilts, antiques, and house plans for the newspaper, had received a quilt block from Gasperik to share with the Detroit Quilt Club members. Edith published a photo and detailed description of this block in the October 22nd, 1938 newspaper. It is Gasperik's practice study for Hungarian girls. In praising Gasperik's work, Edith is in a way issuing a challenge to her local quilters to match the work of the Chicago quilter who had just taken the first prize in applique at the Detroit Quilt Contest held just weeks earlier. That contest was Detroit's 5th and Gasperik's 3rd. It was there that Gasperik won her highest award in Detroit, the top prize in completed applique. You can see that blue rosette winning first prize quilt on display upstairs. It is the quilt called Roses and Forget-Me-Nots. From the very beginning, the Detroit News awarded cash prizes only to quilts made from its own patterns. At actual shows, however, it was clear that visitors preferred admiring and exclaiming over the more original quilts. I think it puzzled my grandmother to realize that what was admired by her most talented quilting peers was not necessarily what won cash prizes, though the cash prizes clearly drew in entries, the large audiences, and new subscriptions. Wanting to sharpen her own quilt making skills, Gasperik needed to be able to see those more original quilts and hear the crowd's response to them. The Detroit quilt shows provided a place for her to do that. It amazes me to realize that Gasperik seems to have been unaware how often Edith Crumb mentioned her in the Detroit newspaper. My research yielded 13 different instances. Gasperik did not subscribe to the Detroit News, but collected copies which she picked up on site in Detroit at the 3-day quilt show events and, at least once, at Wrigley Field as a copy discarded by someone attending a 1935 World Series game between the Detroit Tigers and her beloved Chicago Cubs. Edith reported a month and a half after sharing Gasperik's Peasant Girl blog that her Detroit Quilt Club members were rising to the challenge. Here is a response to Gasperik's blog from a local Quilt Club Corner member whose last name, Seles, suggests that she was herself a Hungarian girl. Edith mentions 3 other Detroit Quilt Club members by name who plan to copy Gasperik's blog. The next evidence that is part of the Hungarian girl's creation story is a document that was probably retrieved by my mother during that last year of my grandmother's life when she was in rapidly declining health, and my mother was trying to make sure that her mother's quilts, most of which remained in her mother's East Hazel Crest house, survived, along with a few documents that could be easily retrieved. It is a letter to Mary Gasperik from Detroit News Quilt Club editor Edith Crum, dated May 3rd, 1940. Edith writes that she's looking forward to seeing Gasperik and her completed Hungarian girl's quilt at the 6th Detroit Quilt Show and Contest coming up in just a few weeks. And she answers Gasperik's question as to whether a doll's quilt can be entered in the upcoming contest in the category called Children's Quilts. Gasperik sent her now completed Hungarian girl's quilt and the doll's quilt to Detroit to be exhibited for the first time. On Friday, May 24th, the opening day of the 3-day show, the newspaper printed this. Yes, we can see that Gasperik's name is misspelled. That happens fairly often. And that 1927 date is misinformation. She actually arrived in America in 1906. The next day's newspaper announced the grand prize winning quilt of this show. It was a quilt called Tree of Life, made by Mrs. Charles Volker, one of the Detroit News Quilt Club's founding and most active members. Well into this article, we read that, quote, Mrs. Mary Gasperik, a prize winner of last year, won second prize, and Mrs. Arthur Miller won third prize with her lovely Patchwork Ladies quilt. A few days later, the Detroit News published its complete list of quilt show winners. It includes Mary Gasperik in a list of children's quilt category prize winners. This seems to provide evidence that both of the items Edith mentioned in her pre-contest letter, Hungarian girls, the quilt, and a doll quilt, were cash prize winners at the 1940 show. I could not find in the news microfilm anything identifying or describing the Gasperik quilt, which won the aforementioned second prize in finished applique. I assumed it must have been Hungarian girls which won this prize. But recently, just months ago in April of 2021, a cache of 40 Gasperik ribbons turned up and was given to the family. Among these is a 1940 Detroit second prize red ribbon, as well as 3 1940 Detroit green honorable mention ribbons and a 1940 pink special premium finished quilts news pattern ribbon, a category which cannot include Gasperik's non-news pattern Hungarian girls quilt. That red ribbon would have been awarded to Gasperik's second prize triumph referred to in the newspaper. I was surprised to see that on the back of that red ribbon is handwritten Tree of Life prize, $15 and $5. To my surprise, it now appears that after all the attention and praise this quilt was given by the Detroit News, Hungarian Girls came home from its debut in Detroit with only a green honorable mention ribbon. Its maker, however, came home with renewed determination to create a quilt which would win the very top prize, the grand prize, at the next Detroit Quilt Contest. She drew her inspiration from a quilt which, although it had come in third to her second prize, was a long-standing crowd favorite at the Detroit News Quilt Show, Mrs. Miller's lovely Patchwork Ladies quilt. Gasperik returned home from that May 1940 6th Detroit Quilt Show and Contest and immediately set to work. The project she began was creation of the quilt we in the family call Colonial Quilting Bee. The Detroit News column, which suggests this, appeared in the November 1940 newspaper. A local Detroit Quilt Club member, Mrs. Mary Sorensen, visited Gasperik on a trip to Chicago and saw what she was beginning to work on. And she presumably shared that information with Detroit Quilt Club members, though Edith Crum is being very cute about it and not saying exactly what Gasperik was embarked on. Gasperik's new quilting project, the Colonial Quilting Bee quilt, is the fanciest possible version of that Patchwork Ladies quilt made by Mrs. Miller, mentioned above in the description of the 1940 quilt show, where it came in third to Gasperik's second prize. It is also a quilt which Gasperik saw and heard greatly acclaimed and admired at the very first Detroit quilt show she attended, the one held in October 1935. The Patchwork Ladies quilt design references the iconic motif of the Detroit News Quilt Club and its annual quilt contests. 20 quilters seated in high-back chairs surrounding 4 more quilters working on a miniature quilt set in a miniature quilting frame. Here is Miller's quilt, as celebrated by Edith Crum in a column featuring Mrs. Miller and her Patchwork Ladies quilt, published following its appearance at that 1935 Detroit Quilt Show. I found Detroit News clippings indicating that other enterprising quilters had made their own versions of this popular quilting ladies design. It seems to have been closely identified with the Detroit Club and shows. Gasperik was determined to demonstrate that she could make the very best version of the News's own quilt symbol to submit to the next Detroit News Quilt Contest. That 7th Detroit News Quilt Contest, alas, was never to be held. World War II intervened, and there never was another Detroit News Quilt Show and Contest. The Quilt Club Corner was disbanded and never resurrected. Gasperik, however, completed her quilt. You can see Gasperik's Colonial Quilting Bee on display upstairs. According to family memory, as well as a fan letter sent to her, Gasperik seems to have herself regarded Colonial Quilting Bee as her best work, the quilt which she wanted to represent her work in a museum collection. As we've already seen, Gasperik perfected her design of the Hungarian dancing girl in 1938, when she sent that finished sample block to Edith Crum, who suggested it would make a lovely pillow cover. I don't know if she drew the dancing girl pattern from scratch, or more likely, found a basic starting point or outline in a published pattern, book illustration, or magazine. The embellishments and crewel work are, of course, likely her own unique contributions and additions. It's a shame that almost none of the quilting patterns she actually used survived her demise or the demise of her house. The fact that her patterns did not survive made my task of researching Gasperik's quilt resources more challenging. I did, however, find traces of the path she took to designing the centerpiece applique on this quilt, the older Hungarian couple. My mother often gave her mother quilt books as gifts. She passed them on to me in the late 1960s, at the same time she was trying to rescue and catalog her mother's quilts. Among them are two books by Kathleen Mann entitled Peasant Costume in Europe, Book 1, published in 1937, and Book 2, published in 1938. A family photograph of Stephen and Mary Gasperik standing side by side in their living room above the Gasperik Market on Cottage Grove Avenue is one of a series of family portraits taken to create a photo album to send to Heidelberg, Germany, to introduce the Gasperiks to the family of their future daughter-in-law, Erika Steckel, who Steve Gasperik Jr., Marion Stephen's eldest son, had met while serving with the armed forces in Germany. Many prints were made of the portrait of Stephen and Mary Gasperik and circulated in the family, but I never realized until well into my Gasperik research project that the book Mary and Stephen are holding is Peasant Costume in Europe, Book 1. That realization caused me to examine the book closely. I came to the conclusion that Mary had used its illustrations to help design from scratch the centerpiece couple of her Hungarian girl's quilt. Here are several illustrations from Mann's Book 1, which might have helped Gasperik design the centerpiece, which she wanted to place inside the circle of Hungarian girls. Mary could not have found a better source to help her design the applique Hungarian couple she planned to place in the center of this quilt, perhaps representing herself and her husband. There is evidence that she struggled with this project. In working on it, she appliqued practice versions onto fabric blocks. One of these survives as a framed applique Mary gave to her daughter Elsie. Another can be seen hanging above the sofa in an old family photograph taken in the home of Mary's brother, George Mihailovitz. Seated on that sofa, left to right, are Stephen Gasperik, Mary Gasperik, their daughter-in-law, Doris Gasperik, and her husband, their younger son, Elmer Gasperik. Mary did not possess the drawing skills of a Marie Webster, a Bertha Stenge, or a Rose Kretzinger. You can see some awkwardness in the central figures that is not present in the perfection of the youthful girls. Gasperik was not adept at writing or drawing, which is not surprising given that her formal education ended with third grade in Hungary, and that she had to become self-supporting at age 16 and in a foreign land. However, you can see for yourself in the Gasperik quilt exhibit here that she could draw with her needle quite expertly. That skill is especially visible if you study her quilting patterns. What often passes for background in quilts of that same era made by others is especially rich in design on Gasperik's quilts. That is because she was so skilled with her needle and thread, and she more easily expressed her creativity in her quilting than in drawing human figures to create paper applique patterns. Having decided that she had practiced enough, Mary then appliqued her centerpiece husband and wife onto her quilt top and did the surrounding embroidery. The next stage was to do the quilting. Here are 4 photos taken by Elmer Gasperik of his mother quilting Hungarian girls in the room where her quilting frame was set up behind the Gasperik store. That was a windowless room, as I remember. Hungarian girls may not have been sufficiently appreciated in Detroit, but the number of first prize ribbons that this quilt won at the Illinois State Fair and its place in the hearts of family members more than makes up for the apparent slight delivered in Michigan. It was a triumph at the Illinois State Fair, where of all the many Gasperik quilts exhibited there, it received the most ribbons. A few months after the quilt came home from Detroit, it went to Springfield, where it won this blue ribbon in the late summer of 1940. In 1960, it won another blue ribbon at the Illinois State Fair. And in 1966, it went back for a third blue ribbon. The quilting patterns Gasperik stitched into her Hungarian girls' quilt include standard issue but expertly rendered repetitive designs, fine cross-hatching in the center, straight double-line quilting fanning out toward the four corners of the quilt, and repetitive arches within the quilt's three scalloped borders. But there are two unique quilted elements on this quilt. Mary copied them from herself. She borrowed from another quilt she had made, one which I was given as a gift from my grandmother. I called my quilt Wildflower Wreaths and hung it over my bed for many years, to my great pleasure, but the quilt's detriment. During my Gasperik research, I learned that my quilt is based on a kit. It is Paragon kit number 01010, called Wildflower Wreaths. Gasperik made the Paragon design, but in her unique fashion, added 6 appliqued meadowlark birds from scraps, some of which I recognize as leftovers from my mother's blouse making. Wildflower Wreaths isn't included in the exhibit upstairs, so the best way I can show you Gasperik's creative reuse of the Paragon pattern in her Hungarian girls' quilt is to display close-ups of the front and back of my Gasperik Wildflower quilt. Please note the detailed floral wreath outlines and the arched feather pattern with large flower embedded in it. These elements make their reappearance in the Hungarian girls' quilt. Recall that Gasperik's Hungarian girls' quilt was sometimes referred to as Hungarian Harvest Festival. It's pretty clear why she resurrected patterns from this Paragon kit and repurposed them as quilting patterns to feature on Hungarian girls. Those flowers and stems of wheat are excellent representations of a real Hungarian Harvest Festival landscape. The dotted lines provided by the kit to guide placement of its floral component pieces would have provided a way for Mary to transfer the kit wreath's outlines onto her quilt top for use as a quilting pattern after she stretched the top into her quilting frame. In closing, I would like to say that the quilt Hungarian Girls, made by my Hungarian grandmother, Mary Gasperik, is a wonderful example demonstrating how carefully and systematically and creatively Mary Gasperik worked at her quilting. Her quilts are the best possible way to try to get to know her. And I believe the Hungarian Girls quilt is the best example for doing that. In closing, I would like to thank the Quilters Hall of Fame for providing my grandmother the honor that they have bestowed on her, and for providing the family the opportunity to exhibit so many of her quilts, and providing me the opportunity to present this story of my grandmother. Thank you. That is me with my grandmother about 1944, sitting on our front porch in Chicago. Here I am with my 2 sisters, Karen and Linda, and all 3 of us are sporting Gasperik pinafores. And here is a 1947 photo. I'm seated at the left, one of the three pigtailed girls on the left, looking a bit sullen. And it looks like my grandmother's trying to comfort me with her right arm there. And that Hungarian doll to the right was named Shari, as I remember. We weren't allowed to play with her very often, but she was a very special doll to us. And about 10 years later, this is the same group in the East Hazel Crest backyard. I'm 16 in the back left. I'm 16 and about to go off to college. And there's my sister Linda in the front and Karen standing next to me. My grandfather's not looking in such good shape, and I believe he died not long after this photo was taken. And this is 1968, my now widowed grandmother. That's my daughter, Cathy, almost 2 years old there in the blue dress, and that's me at the right. This is, she died about 6 months after this photo was taken. And this last photo is a side-by-side. On the left, I am standing with my granddaughter, Emmy Salser Smith, and she's wearing one of the Gasperik pinafores. And again, that's a reprise of me with my grandmother in 1944 on the right.
So thank you, and here I am with you. Yay!
Thank you.
Nice. Really nice.
Yeah, this was a big thing.
It's very big. I'm delighted to have done this again.
Yay!
I'm delighted to have, I feel like she's secure now. Grandmother, she's found her place. She's found her home.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like we all got to welcome her home. I want to welcome Cathy Jacob to share a bit. If you, yes, introduce it. You're another granddaughter of Mary.
I am. I'm the last granddaughter of Mary Gasperik, and I have. I'm the daughter of Elmer, and I have 3 older brothers. And I think the thing that stood out for me was that I was able to share with my daughter and my granddaughter. And my granddaughter, who is 8, was just completely enthralled with everything and didn't know she had a famous grandmother. So it was to teach her about my grandmother and her talents. And I think that my granddaughter also has some of her talent.
I loved seeing the quilts and hearing the 3 lectures. I think I had never seen her quilting context with the other quilts that were created during the time. And so the lecture, Anna Harkin's lecture about more is more helped me understand how different these quilts were from other quilts at the time. And I hadn't understood that. And so it was so amazing to walk upstairs after that lecture and see the quilts and appreciate them and to all be there. And I love the part about her just being a maverick that, you know, so, you know, that she didn't stick with the pattern. She made it her own. And I feel like that's just
Come here.
yeah, I just really resonate with that that determination and that determination and persistence to just do crazy things, like how many quilts and how many stitches and how many yeah.
Well, you do artwork. I mean, isn't it the same process?
Yeah. No, my work it feels just as much of an outlier. It's a different kind of quilting. It's not fabric quilts, but it's quilting of voices and stories, transforming trauma.
You do it with words. Look at that.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. So for me to be together as a family, I invited us to connect with each other by drawing a tree with Mary at the bottom, and then the children and the children's children and the children's children. Like I wanted my kids to get a sense, and as they met each other, like as Sam and Tucker met Caitlin, to be able to see where they connected. And so it was beautiful to see. It surprised me that Sam actually started drawing the tree. I was going to draw the tree, and like he's like, oh,
I thought he'd be on his iPhone.
I know. And like he's like, so he took the paper and he's like, here, I'll take that. So Sam drew the tree, and it was so fun to just welcome us all, to put ourselves on this piece of paper and to make a mark, just to make a mark. And like your brother, his crazy fish, Cathy, and just to have this moment of interaction that wouldn't be happening without art. I wanted us to get to weave our threads of connection together. And so when I think about Mary and the sense of community that she found through quilting, and the sense of connection and her own excellence, her own competitiveness.
Oh yeah.
You know, that she found that language of situating herself in the world through art. And so I loved just getting to invite us all to create something together during the weekend. Yeah.
That's lovely.
Yep.
I think the word resourcefulness and creativity was evident in that entire family. You know, I just felt like, and the authenticity of the family, it's not like any group of people I've come upon very, very often. And it, you know, when you think about that, it was her, you know, this young woman coming across the ocean by herself and then creating all that. You know, it is the American dream. Yeah, I remember this. I was just looking at this, was a Quilters newsletter article that we did. I don't know what year this was, but there it is. One American dream comes true, and it really did. And it was hard. You could tell it was hard for you know, it wasn't an easy thing, but it's so rich with detail, the whole story. That's what I think. I prize my relationship with Susan is that, you know, that you just kept going, you know, 30 years. And, you know, and there were people who fell off along the way, you know, but I felt like every time you contacted me, I thought, okay, let's follow this up. She's got something going here. And it usually
kept responding to me.
Yes.
That kept me
so
going.
I mean, I just felt like it was worth doing. And in the end, whoa, this is an incredible record at the Quilt Index. Really, the fact that you came up with doing this little video, I think I can see ways of sharing this too. It's quite a family.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's the only family I know.
It's a bunch of characters is what it is.
Yeah, a bunch of characters, definitely. And like to hear that Caitlin, how old is she? 8. So that Caitlin wanted to stop by Mary's grave and to see and what she said about why, her reasons why. It was just so moving, and her her honoring of her great grandmother. That was so beautiful. It makes me happy that she exists, that Caitlin exists, and that she was there. And I picture her in 30 years looking at the pictures of her, you know, as an 8-year-old. So I feel like what was created with this induction is more threads of connection that will last and carry forward.
Well, I gave her a Kathleen Mann book to work with.
She already has Post-it notes on pages of things she wants to try.
Ah, wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I couldn't-
She's a character too. She keeps me on my toes.
Yep. She, we made touchstones is the way that it's like quilting, but it's a way of forming threads of connection over time. And I loved that Caitlin wanted to make touchstones in honor of Mary. And to know that she could hold on to that sense of connection. It was so beautiful to get to plant those seeds. Yeah.
I had several of those photos that we drove together, and so I was sitting in the back seat with her, showing her the photos that we were going to use to make the collage of the family. So she latched onto a couple of them, and she wanted to know if she could have them after we used them. And I said, sure, I'll make you all the copies that you want. You tell me. And so one of the photos we did not use. And it was the one because it was the one that Anna had used on each of the printouts for each of the quilts. So we didn't use that in the collage. So she asked me if she could have that, and I said, sure, you can have it. So I gave it to her right away. But the first night, she had on the nightstand next to the bed in the hotel, she had that picture set up. And oh no, it was the night of the touch that you guys made the touchstone. She had the picture of that and the touchstone sitting right up next to her side of the bed with it on the. So it was like a little shrine to Mary. So
Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for making that happen, Cathy. And Susan, that was fabulous. You did a great job.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think it's really, I might take a picture.
Oh, yeah. Here, take one. I'll take a screenshot too. You got that? Here. Wait.
I got it.
Well, thank you all. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yes, we will. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.